Today, we're going to make a delicious cake with coffee and caramel flavors that reminds us a bit of the famous Despacito. You'll see, it's amazing. Coffee lovers are going to love it. First, I mix 50 grams of cornstarch with 300 milliliters of heavy cream. I whisk vigorously until there are no more lumps. Next, I add 10 grams of instant coffee. And so I mix well until the coffee is completely dissolved. However, make sure to use instant coffee and not ground coffee. I set it aside, I heat a saucepan over medium-high heat, and I add 120 grams of sugar. I spread it evenly over the bottom of the saucepan and let it melt without stirring it. Once the caramel has formed nicely, we can start whisking it. Next, I add 30 grams of butter and mix well to melt it. So, once our caramel is ready, we will gently incorporate the mixture of cream, cornstarch, and instant coffee. So, be careful of splashes and avoid pouring it all at once so the caramel shock isn't too high. And, of course, we do all this while stirring constantly. We keep mixing well until the cream thickens. After that, we take it off the heat. Then I pour the cream into a bowl, cover it with plastic wrap directly on the surface, and put it in the refrigerator so it can cool completely. Next, we move on to the sponge cake. In a bowl, I crack 3 eggs, then add 90 grams of sugar, and we're going to beat the sugar with the eggs for 10 minutes. It will start to foam, then lighten in color and triple in volume. So, after 10 minutes, I add a tablespoon of instant coffee and whisk for a few seconds. Next, I sift in the flour, 80 grams. I also sift in 15 grams of unsweetened cocoa powder. I add a packet of baking powder, 7 grams, and a pinch of salt. And we're going to gently fold in the dry ingredients with a spatula, lifting the mixture. The goal is not to deflate the eggs. And finally, my secret for an ultra-soft sponge cake. At the end, I add 10 grams of oil. I mix one last time. The cocoa and coffee sponge cake batter is ready. I preheated the oven to 180 degrees. Next, I butter a 20 cm springform pan. I pour the sponge cake batter into the pan. I tap it slightly to bring the air bubbles to the surface. And I bake the sponge cake for 20 to 25 minutes at 180 degrees. While the sponge cake is baking in the oven, I prepare a soaking syrup. I heat 150 ml of milk with 40 grams of sugar and a teaspoon of powdered vanilla. I mix everything well, bring it to a boil. Check if the sponge cake is done by inserting a toothpick. And if it's cooked, remove it from the heat. Next, we're going to take the sponge cake out of the mold. I set the sponge cake aside on a rack. I don't let it cool completely. I prepare a pastry ring with a cake board and a strip of acetate. You can leave the cake in the springform pan and replace the acetate with parchment paper. I then place the cake on the flat side and poke it with a fork. Next, I pour the soaking syrup over the sponge cake. The cake is still warm. The soaking syrup. When the caramel and coffee cream has cooled well in the refrigerator, I set it aside in a bowl and whip it to loosen it. I then set the cream aside. In another bowl, I pour 350 ml of heavy cream, always with at least 30% fat, and I whip it until it thickens. I mix the first part of the whipped cream into the coffee and caramel cream. I mix it vigorously. I ended up using the mixer to blend it well. And then I gently fold in the rest of the cream, mixing with a spatula. And we get a delicious caramel and coffee mousse. Next, I'm going to pour all of the mousse over the sponge cake. I spread it evenly in the mold. I smooth the surface. For the decoration, I used almonds and toasted almond slivers. And I completely cover the surface of the cake with the almonds. Then I put it in the refrigerator for at least 3 hours before serving. As you can see, removing it from the mold is super easy. I really hope you enjoyed this recipe. See you soon.